Hear about gerrymandering all the time, and right now it's front and center in Virginia with a renewed battle over redistricting and how political maps are drawn. But what does it actually mean, and how does it impact your vote? Author Josh Rultenberg set out to answer exactly that in his new book, Draw the Line in Ohio. It takes a first-hand look at the battle over fair maps and why this issue has really become such a flashpoint across the country. He joins us this morning to talk more about it. Good morning.
Good morning, Simone. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's start where this all began, because when we think of gerrymandering, it's actually not new, right? It's been around since, what, the 1800s?
Yeah, Simone, look, people say that baseball is America's favorite pastime, but really it's gerrymandering, and for all the wrong reasons. A lot of people think that it began in 1812 with former Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry approving a district map that had weird shapes. One of them was drawn like a salamander, and instead they called it a gerrymander, even though it's pronounced gerrymander today. But the origins of this process really date back to even the 1730s, before we were even declared independence in 1776. But now everything's being perfected through software, and lawmakers are drawing these districts down to the street to make sure that they pick their voters instead of the other way around.
I wanted to ask you about this. Let's focus on Virginia, because if this new map holds, it really is a big shift, and it shifts this competitive balance to something like a 10-to-1 split. When the news came down about Virginia, with your expertise on gerrymandering, I'm just curious. I know it's going to stall with the courts, but for now, what did you make of it when the news came down that it had passed?
Yeah, two different things. I mean, first off, this is the most ironic form of direct democracy, because you had voters that were asked the question of, do you want politicians to have more power in shaping these districts than yourselves? And the majority of Virginians said yes, just like in California. This was sold to them as fairness, but the question is fairness to whom? Because I can guarantee you there were a lot of Republican voters that went to bed on Tuesday night and woke up on Wednesday morning wondering where their representation is going to go because of the numbers that you just outlined that theoretically could come to place in Virginia. And so the question is right now is what is obviously going to happen, but let's reframe the conversation from how many seats one party will control versus the other, and now how many voters will have their rights suppressed as a result of what's likely coming down the pike with gerrymandering.
And you've been talking about this. You kind of touched on it a moment ago, but some of the Republicans in Virginia, look, they're completely disenfranchised at this point. They're saying they're being shut out entirely. Do they have a legitimate argument?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, when lawmakers choose their voters instead of voters choosing their lawmakers, this process is just going completely off the rails. And really, it's incumbent upon voters to understand that they are the ones that have the power. The politicians work for us. And so ultimately, when lines are drawn fairly, then what wins the day is just policy positions. And that really should be what our politics and our governing is all about. If one party or one candidate can say to the voters, here are my policy positions, and there are fair districts that are drawn, then ultimately the quote unquote right person will win. But when you have gerrymandered districts, then the cake is baked in primary elections, and general elections no longer matter.
So we've seen this play out, right, across the country. Your book details this. Texas, Ohio, Virginia, with possibly Florida up next on the docket. Is this now just the political standard strategy on both sides?
It doesn't have to be. Again, this is a choice for voters, not just in Virginia, but around the country. What we're still waiting to see ultimately is what happens at the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is going to decide what happens with the Voting Rights Act. And if that falls, you're going to see potentially a lot more gerrymandering happening in the South, in Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina. But voters right now have a choice. Again, you need to become more politically engaged. You can't just tune in and tune out when there's a special election like this, or if there's a presidential election every 4 years. If they want to truly take the power back away from these politicians, then they can. It's just a matter of, is this going to happen? And are these parties ultimately going to continue to fight one another? Because we're seeing right now, it's just a race to the bottom.
All right. Author Josh Rultenberg, certainly appreciate the conversation this morning. Thank you.